you have to be a strategic thinker and you can't be a check the box approach. And so from my vantage point, this is where a CEO has to understand in healthcare. If you want to truly transform an organization, if you truly want to meet your mission and be as impactful to your patients, then you have to invest in your people. And the only way to invest in your people is to have a robust, comprehensive learning and development team. You have to have a comprehensive learning and development budget. When you look at budgets in healthcare and learning and development, they are usually so small compared to the overall budget. That's abysmal. We should not have a situation like that. We have to invest in our people. That's truly why we have the challenges we have.
Well, Geoffrey, it's really great to have you. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you after getting introduced through one of our investors. And since then, just learning about your work in healthcare, in learning and development, all the work you're doing in your own academic endeavors, it's been really inspiring to hear about. So I'm excited to dive in today. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, you're really someone who has a lot of insight and shares a lot of perspective on healthcare and workforce. So why don't we just go straight there? I guess overall, maybe let's start by saying, what do you think are the most pressing challenges in healthcare workforce that you see today?
Yeah. So let me say, I always tell people I came into, this space very non-traditional, really the, leading workforce development, in the work that I do at Siemens Healthineers and working with hospital systems around the country. I didn't come into this as a traditional learning and development type of leader. I actually came into this having worked in hospital leadership in a non-clinical area where I led multiple departments, but had the opportunity very closely to partner with, learning and development. And in many ways, actually was the type of director in my hospital days that would push learning and development comfortably and sometimes uncomfortably to be moving us to a different type of situation. But look, I sit here, as somebody who's been in this space now for 16 years, so obviously showing my age with that remark. But the reality of it is this. Everything that we're facing in healthcare today, we all knew was going to be what we're facing. We just didn't deal with it. Like a lot of times in healthcare where we're risk averse and we don't tend to deal with things, we just let it get worse and worse and worse. And then a pandemic happened and it just exacerbated what already was the issue. What I'm talking about there is we've got a significant crisis in shortage. We also specifically have challenges around culture. And so, the reality of it is here's the truth. We've invested in learning and development for leaders, usually director and up, but we haven't invested in learning and development at the middle. And we certainly haven't invested as much in learning and development at the more entry level. And so we have not created a great trajectory. And to me, that's some of the biggest issues that we're facing.
Interesting. And tell me a little bit more. Why do you think there is delay in putting in the right investment for learning and development for not just the leaders, but like the layers down the organization?
I think it truly comes down to prioritizing. And so, when you think about it, and here's where some people will say, ooh, he's being a bit interesting in his approach here. Traditionally, learning and development sits in human resources. And if you look at, in the healthcare space, that is traditionally a very transactional type of area. We hire, we fire, we recruit, we do things very much check the box. We're not necessarily thinking about transformation. We're not necessarily thinking about strategy as much. Now, I will say that's changing, and some healthcare systems are doing fundamentally awesome work in that space. I think of chief learning officers like Hillary Miller when I answer that. Hillary is truly a dynamo in the work that she does and has done it successfully in multiple healthcare systems. But you have to be a strategic thinker, and you can't be a check the box approach. And so from my vantage point, this is where a CEO has to understand in healthcare. If you want to truly transform an organization, if you truly want to meet your mission and be as impactful to your patients, then you have to invest in your people. And the only way to invest in your people is to have a robust, comprehensive learning and development team. You have to have a comprehensive learning and development budget. When you look at budgets in healthcare and learning and development, they are usually so small compared to the overall budget. That's abysmal. We should not have a situation like that. We have to invest in our people. And that's truly why we have the challenges we have.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's dive a little bit more into that. I sit on the side of a learning and development like founder, like creating solutions to provide to enterprises. And I definitely see trends of certain sectors. L&D is seen as a really important part of the company. Like, it's necessary. Whereas in other places, it's seen as a nice to have or a benefit. Now, one thing that's really interesting about healthcare is that it is a very people-centric business.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it has a very strong formal education path to gain the technical skills needed to get there. So it almost, to me, feels like the expectation of the company is we're bringing people who are already trained. Training is not our mandate. Versus there's some other industries where they're bringing like totally green folks and then have to mold them and shape them into the professionals they need. They actually really invest in training.
Yeah.
I'm curious if like this kind of description is something you see, and in organizations where they're strategic, why they go above and beyond the formal education. Like what happens in the organization such that they are like, we need to go beyond that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're 100% correct. And I'll say, I mean, look, from a clinical perspective, obviously you have to have licensure. You have to have what's expected by, all those respective state boards. No question. I think, though, in my humble opinion, both as somebody who's worked in healthcare and actually been a faculty member at numerous institutions teaching these subjects, the reality is that we've basically taken every role in healthcare and we've put it through the same test. And it's, you have to have a degree. Just because the clinical area has to have a degree, or just because the clinical area has to have this years of experience, we're going to require in all these other areas. Even in my hospital days, when I was a director, I can't tell you how many times I had to fight to hire somebody who didn't have a high school diploma or who just had a high school diploma. And, one time I had to fight for over a year to promote somebody who had only a high school diploma, because in their eyes, in human resources eyes, they had to have a college degree to be promoted into a management role. And I said, that's hogwash. How could you truly decide that somebody is better just because of a college degree? Then when I did my homework and I got to know and did my research in our organization, I found that we had an executive team member who didn't have a college degree. So I called the director of HR and I said, hey, this person doesn't have a college degree. Why is it that this person was able to reach the C-suite, but the person I want to promote can't be promoted just because she doesn't have a college degree? Well, ultimately, that discrepancy led to me getting that person promoted. And then ultimately, we did work to change that, where you didn't necessarily have to have a college degree, with some ramifications. But I think healthcare has been a space where we've tended to create rules and we don't change them because that's healthcare. It's the reality of it is we just kind of stick with it. And now times are different. We don't necessarily have the luxury where people are flocking to want to work in healthcare as we once did. And so now we have to have what I consider to be multi-generational solutions to how we approach learning and development, how we approach human resources. And we have to your point, consider experience, consider skills, consider passion, consider purpose, not just a college degree. Now, we're not going to get away with that in the clinical space unless we change some accreditation, licensure, et cetera. That's a different matter. I also wouldn't want to be taken care of by a nurse, obviously, if they don't have the credentials, or be taken care of by an X-ray technologist if they don't have the credentials. But we do have to change some of the models.
Interesting. Okay, so let's dive more into your point about the urgency and opportunity of now. For any sort of change to happen, I think you usually need to get the timing right, but also change emerges from like a pocket of the the industry or space that have the right conditions met for the change to happen from there, right? Whether it be there's actually authority to change or willingness to change or capability to change. So can you hit a little bit more on what is happening right now in healthcare such that you think the need for improved L&D is becoming, it's starting to hit the threshold? Or well, is it hitting the threshold? And if so, like, and why? And which pockets of the vast healthcare industry are you most excited to see progress?
Yeah. I mean, the reality of it is we have significant retention challenges in healthcare in ways that we've never necessarily experienced before. And a lot of that truly comes down to organizational culture, people not feeling valued, appreciated, respected in the workplace. And survey after survey clearly suggests that one of the ways that people feel appreciated, valued, respected is when they're invested in from a learning and development standpoint. In fact, this year, 2 years in a row, there's been surveys done in healthcare systems where overwhelmingly they've cited that overpay, they'll choose to stay in a healthcare system if their organization invests in them to continue to grow. And I think that that's a really powerful statement. And I also think it speaks to that multi-generational impact that we're seeing. Younger generations, myself as a millennial, you as a millennial, and the younger generations really do want to continue to grow. That's a strong desire. They want to learn. They want to grow. They want to be promoted. And I think that type of feedback is super important for us to not only take into, but then act on it. The other piece that I think is super important to recognize is we don't also have as many people entering these academic programs and the clinical areas as we once had either. I mean, there is less people entering nursing programs. There's less people entering MD schools. There's less people entering pretty much every single role in healthcare. Well, why is that? Well, certainly I'm sure during the pandemic, when you saw the headlines and you saw different articles and you saw news stories about the challenges, the burnout, the crisis that they're facing, et cetera, certainly doesn't help. I'll also add that I think politically, we've had a lot of people that have bashed healthcare in a not so healthy way that has made it seem like it's not the space to work in. And so we have a lot of work to do to help people understand, in my opinion, there is no better industry than healthcare. But at the same time, we've got to fix that culture because we can't get people in and then not have the right culture and just have them leave. That's also what we're having to face right now. The final point I'll make is the middle management part. This is the part that scares me right now about healthcare, is we have done such a poor job of true succession planning. We haven't grown, from bottom up. And the only way to grow from bottom up is to invest in learning and development. As somebody who served for a decade in a healthcare system, I was always frustrated, and I vocalized this regularly, that we would always do leadership development for directors and above. And so there were times where I would actually just not go, and I would send a member of my team who was in like a specialist role or a coordinator role. And then I'd get a call and they'd say, well, they're not really supposed to be here. Where are you? And I'd say, they're there because I asked them to be there. And so they are there. And they would say, yeah, but that has to have permission. I said, I'm the director giving permission. So what else permission do you need? Well, really, we need the executive team member sponsor to give permission. Okay. So I would call my SVP up and say, hey, Steve, do you give permission for so-and-so to attend this? Yes. And here's the deal. Do you know what division in that healthcare system had the highest employee engagement? Ours. Do you know what healthcare system had the highest investment in their people? Ours. Because we had an executive who believed that you learn from the bottom up and you promote from the bottom up. And so, that's the difference that you have to have is we sit here at a time where we still have all these challenges, yet all the answers are literally just talk to the workforce, talk to the people. They'll tell you what they want, and then we have to act on it.
Yeah, that's this thing about creating like a system where it's expected for you to grow from where you start all the way to the senior leaders, and there are actually ladders that are in place for people to get there, I think is very important. Why do you think that, what is your sense as to why that ladder doesn't exist quite yet. Is it just that in the past people always laterally hire in, and so you don't need to cultivate? I'm just curious. What drives that as a current state?
So I regularly say that healthcare has never really been a place that has true pathways. I usually say, if you be back in our childhood, for those that remember the game Chutes and Ladders, that is exactly the structure and framework that healthcare has. There's very few areas of healthcare where you actually have clinical ladders or ladders. For example, nursing. Very clear way to grow in the nursing field. You come in as a diploma nurse or a baccalaureate nurse. You can grow to various different ways. And there's different board certifications. There's different levels. There's different ladders. Every system may have a little nuances, but very, very clear. Outside of that, not so much, especially in the non-clinical areas. And so, and if you're an employee, you really have no idea. Unless you have a good boss or a good leader or a good mentor, you really have no idea. And so, look, this is where, again, I feel that in healthcare, and maybe not dissimilar in other industries, but I can only speak to healthcare. And certainly I could speak to higher education, which is another subject. But human resources is very, in my opinion, reactive, not proactive, traditionally. And so, and again, I've got a lot of theories as to why that is. I think some of it is they check the box. They're not necessarily looking to be transformative and innovative. And ultimately, what is absolutely necessary is to create career pathways that have some standardization, but are also personalized. And create career pathways that consider things like apprenticeships, like youth apprenticeships, like youth career exploration. Create pathways if you have areas that require degrees, okay, but then have an upskilling way so that if I don't have a college degree, how do I earn credit for prior learning while I'm doing this role that I can then take into that college and get that degree ultimately quicker because I've done work that is actually for credit. And so, this is critical. And from my vantage point to your question, we have lost so many amazing people in our healthcare systems because we haven't helped them understand the pathway. Or we've promoted them into a leadership role without actually properly and adequately training them to do the job that they were promoted to do. And then we lose them. This happens in nursing leadership all the time. And so, again, that's where we're not investing in our people. Just because we want to promote someone doesn't mean we shouldn't give them a personal development plan. In fact, in my healthcare system, where I was for a decade, my executive, my senior vice president, who I give a lot of credit to for truly being a phenomenal leader, he made every one of us have a personal development plan. In fact, when I entered in June of 2008, I had a personal development plan from June 2008 until the end of my tenure in 2017 there. And that personal development plan would be reviewed every quarter with he and I or whoever my boss was. And I had to review it with my team members. And my supervisors who reported to me had to review it with their team members. That's how you do truly learning and development. And sometimes it was ambitious and sometimes it was audacious. Some of the ideas I had in mind were crazy. But guess what? Some of them were actually things that I only achieved because I had an executive who pushed me, who encouraged me, who inspired me. One was my master's degree. I didn't really think I was going to go on and get a master's degree. He said to me, not only will it make a difference for you, but for your career, it's going to make a big difference. And so he put it on there and he said, here's the deal. I know you're busy. I know you've got a lot on your plate. He said, I will make sure you can attend a program and do it even during the workday if you need to. That's what we need to do when we care for our people.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's also been great that you've been able to see like a model of people investment that you found really valuable. I guess a question for you would be, there are usually like pockets of excellence that emerge, and then those pockets of excellence often happen either you have an exceptional leader who just has a different perspective. In your case, it almost sounds like that this individual was very different than like what the system was how the system normally behaved. Mm-hmm. Or within the broad systems, there's like a small segment that just operates differently and therefore has different set of incentives and and so I'd be curious, like, are there any sub segments within healthcare, whether it be like sub industries or like size of companies or geography, where you're saying, actually, I think in those health parts of healthcare systems, I'm seeing like better behaviors and incentives around people development L&D happening that you think we should like learn and scale from?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And to your point, the leader that I was referring to was, in healthcare for 40 years when he was my senior executive. And he worked his way up from food services, literally, was a food service dietary aide, made his way into materials management, worked in materials management purchasing for a number of years, then became, a leader there, and then worked his way all the way up to a senior vice president role. Similarly, my president and CEO for the majority of my tenure at our healthcare system, who I always consider to be my greatest inspiration for my whole career, was the same way. Worked her way as a nurse, in New York, and grew up in New York healthcare systems, which she always said was the best experience ever. And then ultimately made her way to the president and CEO spot, and by far the best executive leader I've ever worked for and ever met in my life. I will say, though, to answer your question, that where I see significant opportunities in healthcare to scale and really think differently about this is a couple areas. One, I would move learning and development into a separate C-suite role. Either make it a C-suite role or have it report to the chief strategy or chief transformation officer, or the chief operating officer, or the CEO. It should not sit in human resources. It is absolutely the worst place for it to sit. It needs to sit in a place where it truly correlates to moving the organization forward. It also has to sit in a place that speaks to growth, strategy, transformation, and all aspects that relate back to quality and patient safety. Because ultimately, when we invest in our people, we're also investing in the people who take care of our patients or who serve our patients. And so that's the biggest thing I would say. The second is generally what I have found is in healthcare, we have not fully harnessed the power of the partnership with academia, or the power and partnership with startups in this space. And, every healthcare system generally has a vision to almost create their own university or create their own learning academy. Well, you're not going to be able to do that internally at a scalable way. But you could if you partner with an institution or partner with an organization in that space. And I would highly suggest that healthcare systems truly look at that, because generally they don't have the resources to be able to scale as effectively. I mean, even your largest healthcare systems, when you look at their learning and development teams, let's say they're a system of 100 some thousand total workforce, that learning and development team is probably not more than 100 people, just based on my own observation, sometimes even less than that. And so, we have got to think about that, to your point, scalability. The final point I'll just say is I generally feel, and this again is just my observation and based on my experience, that leaders who remember their humble beginnings as it relates to this topic tend to do better when it comes to investing in their people. And so to your earlier point, like, I had a leader who really cared about this because he didn't forget where he came from. Same as my president and CEO. And so as he was mentoring me and as she was mentoring me, in fact, I will never forget the conversation I had. It was right around Christmas time many years ago with my president and CEO. I was reporting to her at the time. And I told her, I said, I want to be promoted. And I said, if I'm not, I will consider other opportunities outside of the organization. Pretty bold move. Some people would say I wouldn't do that, but I was bold at that point in time. And she looked at me and she said, I will promote you when I believe you're ready. And when I do, I don't want anyone in this organization to question that, because you will be the youngest person promoted in this healthcare system in history. into a director level role. And I said, well, then when are you doing it? And she said to me, I will do it when I'm ready. Came back from the holiday. She calls me up to the office and she says to me, are you ready? And I remember sitting there like, oh, wow. Like, she really got me. She called my cards right on this. And I looked at her and I said, I think so. And she said, not think. She said, because healthcare is tough. She said, when you can come back to me and say, you know you are, I'm going to make it happen. And she said, and here's the deal. You will go out there and you will prove everyone that this was the best decision for our healthcare system. What I appreciated about that was also she was challenging my confidence. She was the type of leader that knew that unless I also had self-confidence, that timing was not exactly right. Now, it did happen not shortly after that. And I'll tell you, she had to battle with HR for that because I didn't go the traditional HR route. And that's why I share this story. In HR's view, I needed to go supervisor, manager, director. She said no. She said, I believe, and obviously she could because she was the CEO. She said, I believe he's ready to be a director. And her questioning of me actually was very intentional because she could have just promoted me as a supervisor very quickly. She could have moved to manager if she wanted, but she did director. And there was a reason she did director. Because if I became a director, I had more authority over significant spending and also significant people responsibility. And that was HR's hesitancy. Well, he's never managed people yet. And so I share this because I fear in healthcare far too often. We have people who may have good intentions, particularly in HR, that are holding people back. And I have never been the type of leader that believes that we should be doing that. In fact, one time in my organization, I had a colleague who I knew wanted to move on. He was very vocal with me. And so instead of me fighting to try and keep him, I gave him an opportunity to meet with what became his future employer. And I will never forget HR when I called them and let him know that he was leaving. They said, well, now you're going to lose the position. And I said, why am I losing the position? And they said, well, you should have worked to retain him. I said, oh, okay. So I called my executive up, told this story. My executive called the chief human resource officer and said, you can't steal my position without me agreeing to it. Thank you very much. We have that position and we're hiring next week for it. So, I just think that we've made non-people focused decisions in healthcare. And to your earlier question, we haven't thought about career mobility. We haven't thought about economic mobility. And we certainly haven't thought about pathways.
The story you shared was really powerful. And if I had to extract like one sort of insight, maybe, that it triggered in my mind is like what I thought you said was really powerful. Like people with humble beginnings tend to have like stronger investment in people development and be more engaged people leader. I actually think it fundamentally comes down to the following, which is, do you believe that people have the potential to really grow into new roles and elevate? Or do you see people as in like a box and you're like, you're here and that's the role, and like to go here, that's too far, right? And like, so I think that, and people with humble beginnings actually have changed so much throughout their life. They believe like change and transformation is possible. And so they like look at someone, but they see like 4 or 5 steps down the line. Because they like what they're projecting is, oh, I was there several years ago, but I also see mindsets and certain behaviors that suggest that they can get to where I am today if I give them the right tools. Whereas I think if you haven't seen that, right, then you don't necessarily believe that's possible. You believe, okay, we can throw all the L&D and training as much as possible, but it's not going to change. And let's be real. there are a lot of L&D and training programs that have like no impact. And it's using, you put in a ton of money and like people are not changing. Now, what's interesting about that is like, I wonder if that also provides some clues as to why, as to how you might spark change like this, which is how do you find the people who have lived experiences in moving through the system from the bottom up and actually elevating in the system, and how do you harness them? Because they actually are more likely to have the clues to creating a much more engaged workforce and a stronger like pathway.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I will tell you that the one individual I shared the story about that I promoted who didn't have a high school diploma was probably was definitely one of the best leaders our organization ever had. And I say that because she was a massive connector. She knew everybody. She literally started as a unit secretary. And let me just say this. In healthcare, everyone is essential. Everyone is integral. And so I say that because I will never forget the time I was working to promote her. And our director of HR, God bless her, said to me, her only real experience was a high school diploma, and then she started as a unit secretary. And I will never forget her saying that. Me being me, and me knowing a lot about my organization, because keep in mind, my mother worked at the same organization for many years. So I grew up there. I said to the director, so did you. And I said, and guess what? You're now a director. So how dare you hold another person back? And I'll never forget my senior vice president saying to me, because he heard all about it, because obviously things would, he said to me, he said, wow, he said, boy, you know how to advocate for your people. He said, but I'm so proud of you. And I looked at him and I said, I only did it because I learned from you. Now, this person went on to serve many years in the role she had, even beyond when I was there, very successfully. And at one point in time when I was still there, we had a big event as a healthcare system for our entire first responder community, because she was the leader of our EMS service line. I was the administrative director of the area. She was the clinical leader. She received a standing ovation for her work. And our chief human resource officer was present. And I will never forget this, because our senior VP made sure to make sure she knew that it was her area that was holding this individual back for many years. And as you can imagine, knowing who I am, as you do, I made sure from the rostrum where I was to make a beeline eye contact with the chief human resource officer. And I mouthed, because I'll never forget it, and people in the audience remember it, I told you so. Because I knew her impact. And that impact had such a ripple effect, because it led to other people thinking about other individuals that also could be a part of that. And again, we started to make some difference. And I'll never say enough about our director of organizational development at the time, because again, she reported to HR, but she was working really hard. In fact, it was during her tenure that instead of just leaders getting crucial conversation training, just leaders getting different aspects of communication training and leadership development training, she for the first time said, why is it just leaders getting it? Why aren't we doing it for everybody? And so she started to knock down the silos. But what became apparent was she didn't have the resources. She had 3 people, and we were an organization of several thousand, that she could scale that. And so, again, we have to get back to investing in our people. And we have to stop this idea that just because they don't, have this years of experience or this degree. When I got my job, I earned a job that required 5 years of experience. I didn't have 5 years. I was a college grad. And the same senior VP that I've told these stories about was who hired me. And later in my tenure, I one time asked him, I said, I obviously know you hired me over other people, I said, I didn't realize you hired me over some very senior people for the role that you hired me. And he looked at me and he said, do you want to know the answer why I hired you? And I said, I guess. He goes, passion and purpose. He said, I didn't have to think about anything else. He said, I knew you were going to bring passion into the work and you were always going to have purpose. He said, the rest I feel was trainable. He said, and look where we are today. That's the type of leadership we need in healthcare. And I'll go so far, that's the type of leadership, if I were encouraging boards in healthcare to be thinking about, boards of directors, trustees in healthcare need to be holding the senior executives, the CEO accountable to say, what are you doing to invest in your people? What are you doing around career mobility? What are you doing around retention? What are you doing around culture? Because when we focus on it, we see the difference made. I'll give you some tangible examples. Take a look at MD Anderson. If you ever want to look at a healthcare system that has powerful culture, powerful investment in learning and development, robust approaches, a leadership development academy, great people, great leaders, and they're investing in people at all levels, why do you think their retention is through the roof? It's a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer. But yet we sit here in this same sector and we look around and we say, well, I don't know why they're doing it so special, but we don't have. It's not that special. It's because they're investing in their people. But it all comes down from the top. Does the CEO care about these things? Does the CFO care about these things? Instead of being a CFO of no, which is oftentimes, unfortunately, sometimes the case, when it comes to people, CFOs need to say yes. That's the difference that can be made.
Let's now look at what are the kinds of skills or mindsets or behaviors you think are really important looking forward. There's obviously a lot of things changing, right? Like especially in healthcare, there's multiple mega trends that are intersecting. Demographic shifts, technological disruptions, just even regulations, and so what are you thinking? Like when you talk about we need to invest in people, what are the capabilities that are so important? Maybe talk about like top 3 to 5.
Yeah. So I think the top skill for anyone that works in healthcare today, or anyone that wants to work in healthcare, is adaptability. I mean, we have to be able to adapt and be agile with just an industry that, to your point, technologically and even non-technologically is ever changing. And the other piece I think that's super important around that too is we have, roughly they say 5 different generations in the workplace, and healthcare is a great place where we absolutely still do. And we haven't, in my opinion, harnessed the power and the ingenuity of each of those generations. Mm-hmm. And when we do, I think we can have the most magnetic culture possible. I will say, to your point, technologically, we have to be continuing to think about AI and certainly the implications on the workplace from that. Now, here's the deal. We're going to still need people in healthcare. AI cannot replace people. There may be workflows, there may be things financial, there may be things on the HR end, there may be things in different aspects of the system that AI can help, just like it does in imaging today, just like it does in surgery, and just like it does in other areas. But it can't replace people. And what we have to truly invest in is reminding us as a system that we have to have humans in healthcare that actually deliver empathy. We have to have humans that care for people through compassionate exercises and experiences. In fact, if you look at one of the areas of healthcare that's been the most challenging, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, it's patient engagement. And when you read patient surveys overwhelmingly, what patients are saying is they don't feel like they're being heard. That just comes down to basic empathy, basic compassion, basic service. And so we have to train on those types of things, which is why, again, learning and development matter. We've got to train and we got to hold people accountable. And so, those are a couple of the top things. And then the final thing I'll just say is, to your point on regulation, right? We have, we're sitting at a really interesting time because we've had an administration for 4 years that has really worked very aggressively, both at the Department of Health and Human Services and at the Department of Justice, to advance health equity and civil rights, particularly in the healthcare space. We don't know what the next administration will do in that space. But here's the deal. The dignity of each person matters. And so we have to continue to move towards health equity. We have to work towards eliminating healthcare disparities. We can't continue to have a system where we have haves and have-nots. And we certainly can't continue to have a system in maternal medicine or maternal care where if you're Black and brown, you feel like you're not heard, and you generally are higher predisposed to losing a baby during pregnancy than compared to a white mom. That's crazy to think here in the United States that's the case, but it is. And so we have to continue to move the needle there. And so my final point there is we've got to really train and educate and retrain and re-educate on all the aspects of quality care around competency-based medicine, meaning culturally, we have to understand different cultures. We've got to really invest in those spaces. And so my message there is this, if you're in a state where your governor or your legislature has said to you, you can't do diversity, equity, inclusion, just remember those same people may not have the same inequities that others do. And so we in healthcare have a dignity and a responsibility to take care of everybody. And so that means everybody. And so we still have to take care of their needs. And we have to be thoughtful about it because we've got to move the needle here.
Let's maybe end on a final note about one thing that you think other healthcare system leaders like yourselves, that are kind of at the intersection of healthcare and workforce. Like one thing that these leaders can do to really help accelerate the right type of change. And maybe you can use even examples of things that you're trying to do in order to affect change in your own context.
Yeah, without question, I believe, particularly if we think about how to build a future-ready, sustainable healthcare workforce, we've talked a lot about different elements of that. But the sort of icing on the cake that I would just say is we have to absolutely really think about prioritizing how we engage the youth in our community and give them experiences far before they have a college degree. That means we really have to, as a healthcare system, both at a federal, at a state, and at an employer level, invest in things like youth apprenticeships that lead to apprenticeships. I'm also a very, very strong believer, and I know for my higher ed colleagues and for accreditors, they may kind of take a seat back when they hear this, but we've got to move to apprenticeship degrees in the United States. Europe has it. It works out very, very well. We can't continue the traditional higher ed structure for healthcare anymore. We have to be able to earn and learn on the job. It's the best model for healthcare. When we learn and earn on the job, we have a great opportunity to kind of create this very sticky career mobility and career pathways and talk about retention. I've studied this. I've been to many healthcare systems in the US, and healthcare systems that have invested in youth apprenticeships and apprenticeships. UW Health in Madison, Wisconsin is a great example. And their director there, who has become a dear friend, Bridget Willey, is truly doing sustainable transformational work that is retaining at higher levels than any other data I've ever seen in healthcare, just because of the program she's built for the youth, to a youth apprenticeship, to career pathways, to an apprenticeship. And now she even has 2 apprenticeship degrees with her local tech college where they're learning and earning on the job. That's what we need. We've got to invest in those types of things. And I think those types of models, we just have to continue to, I don't want to necessarily say replicate because everything has to have some nuances, but we need to really look to mirror them in other communities.
Geoffrey, this was a really enlightening and thought-provoking conversation around things you see in healthcare. I think you were very honest and candid about things you like about things you think should change. And what has shaped your views around the opportunities too. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share those. And I'm looking forward to more conversation with you, especially around developing leaders like bottom up through the system. That particularly resonates with me given my immigrant background. So thank you.
You're so welcome.